Thomas Peters is the cultural director for the National Organization for Marriage. Joins me here this afternoon. Hello, Thomas.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for being here. So what's the purpose of this, really?
Well, I think it's just to push back against this idea that, Dan Savage is some sort of biblical expert or moral theologian. And just say if you want to have a fair debate about what the Bible and traditional morality says about marriage, let's have it. And, I think also especially what Brian Brown was trying to do is stand up for, the kids that Dan Savage decided to go after. The thing is, Dan Savage, I think, kind of has this coming to him because he says he's this, anti-bullying guru who spends a lot of time bullying Christians, and particularly going after Christian teens. I think is just, beyond the pale. And, even in the way that Dan decided to accept the challenge as unrepeatable on radio. So I'm looking forward to the debate. My boss is a Oxford-trained historian, so I think Dan might have bitten off a little bit more than he could chew here.
Well, and I don't think that Dan Savage has ever presented himself as a biblical expert and nothing ever close to a theologian, as far as I know. This is going to come down to a debate over gay marriage, don't you think?
I think that's the core issue here, but I think around the issue of what our marriage laws should reflect are these other questions about just the role of civility and how you debate it. People who push gay marriage, the leaders of this movement, have done it in a particularly venomous way, in my opinion. Using labels like bigot and hater and stuff like that. And so, if we're ever going to have any sort of resolution about what our marriage laws should reflect, there's going to be a change in tone in how we do it. And Dan Savage, while saying that he's in favor of this, hardly practices what he preaches. So, I think I'm personally hoping for is that the debate is done civilly and fairly and with a little bit of just courtesy and human respect. I think that actually, I've been to debates like that.
We are talking about Dan Savage.
Yeah, but
the guy.
This is Dan Savage's position that, he says that people who have traditional marriage views are ignorant and rude and bigoted. Well, I'd like to see someone call him out on that. I think Brian started that. But this is someone, President Obama, Michelle Obama have all taped things for Dan Savage campaign. So, this is not some, shock jockey. This is a guy who's very much part of the political establishment, setting standards for how kids are educated and who people look up to.
Well, I think Dan Savage, and, I've met him on a couple of occasions, but I've known of him. We are both here in Seattle. And here's what I know of Dan Savage. I think that Dan Savage is very passionate about his defense of gay marriage, and I think he's become very tired of the arguments used against it. And I think that's in part what we were witnessing when he was addressing that high school auditorium on the issue of journalism.
Well, if he's tired of the arguments, he should spend time refuting them and not attacking the people who make them. And, I watched most of that video, and I didn't really recognize any of the arguments that I've seen used at the National Organization for Marriage. So maybe we're talking past each other here. And if that's the case, then I'm really looking forward to seeing Dan and Brian in the same room, because in my experience, gay marriage activists are very selective about which arguments they think traditional marriage opponents are actually using. The arguments that we use are from reason, common sense, our legal tradition, and also the social sciences in terms of how children flourish and what the public purpose of marriage is. That's nothing about what Dan went after in his speech on journalism.
That's unusual because and I have been a long time, very strong advocate for gay marriage, and I use common sense and reason and family values as the argument that I put forth in favor of it.
Yeah, so what do you think Dan was talking about?
I think Dan, in the moment, I think everyone succumbs to a level of frustration at times. He is embedded in this issue. I'm not gay. He is. I don't have a male partner as a guy. He does. He looks at the years that he has tried to put forth this manner of being able to formalize a relationship between people who fall in love with one another. And I have seen this from both sides. I have heard the vitriol from the right. I have heard the vitriol from the left. I don't know what purpose it serves. I think everybody chooses their own course to address this issue. I'm just glad that it is being addressed. I'm glad that Washington State has passed a law, and I'm fairly confident that the referendum that's being put together here and the initiative, which I think is sponsored by the National Organization for Marriage, I don't think that that's going to have any impact on what the governor signed into law a couple of months ago.
Well, the National Organization for Marriage is behind Referendum 74. We're looking forward to winning our marriage amendment in North Carolina tomorrow, and we believe that if citizens of the state of Washington State get the opportunity to vote on marriage, they will follow what 30 other such states have done, which is to affirm that to make a marriage you need a husband and a wife. So that's our strong position. And I'm hearing what you're saying about sort of the tiredness on both sides, perhaps. But I think there's no level of tiredness that justifies profanity and personal attacks, and that's something that Dan Savage has traded in, and it's something that we at the National Organization for Marriage have always conscientiously, explicitly, and categorically avoided and denied.
Well,
that's no way to have a public
here's,
debate about anything.
Here's the thing, and I'm talking with Thomas Peters, who's the cultural director for the National Organization for Marriage. And here's what I've heard, Peter. I've heard really vitriolic, denigrating comments made by religious leaders on the right when they talk about gay marriage. And then they try to mollify things by saying, well, we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. And I don't know if that placates people at this juncture.
Well, let me set up a distinction. When people on our side have said something like that, NOM is always very careful to distance ourselves from, those sort of comments and say, that's not us. That's not our movement. I'm not aware. But wait a minute. I'm not aware of anyone. I'm not aware of any major gay rights organization that has ever tried to distance itself from Dan Savage's particular way of attacking opponents. So if we're talking about self-policing movements, I agree with you. I think it's more of the people who are pushing gay marriage that have to start talking about that. But you can't put us all in the same boat if we say we're not part of that same boat.
No, and I don't think you can put the pro-gay marriage people in the same boat. And just for the sake of illustration here, there was a lot of discourse over the manner in which Dan Savage addressed those students, and there were a lot of people who are generally on his side who didn't like what he did and did speak out against it. But this is going to be interesting. I'll tell you what, I hope it's televised, because if it is, I'm going to watch it. Thomas Peters, the Cultural Director, National Organization for Marriage, I do appreciate your time. Thanks for talking to me today.